The stagecoach that rolled into Sweetwater, Montana territory on that scorching July afternoon in 1882 carried more than dust and weary travelers. It carried a woman whose violet eyes told stories of suffering that would change one cowboy's life forever. Thomas Mercer stood outside the general store, his weathered hands gripping a list of supplies his ranch needed, when he noticed her stepping down from the coach with movements that spoke of pain carefully hidden. She wore a deep blue traveling dress that had seen better days, and a bonnet that shadowed most of her face. But when the wind caught the brim and lifted it for just a moment, Thomas saw the angry purple bruise that bloomed across her left cheekbone and the split in her lower lip that had barely begun to heal. Thomas was 28 years old, a decade into running the ranch his father had left him, and he had seen his share of hardship in this unforgiving land. He had watched droughts kill cattle, winters freeze good men to death, and desperation turn neighbors into thieves, but nothing had prepared him for the way his heart clenched at the sight of this stranger's injuries, or the protective fury that rose in his chest like a flash flood in a canyon. The woman clutched a small carpet bag in both hands and looked around the dusty main street of Sweetwater with an expression that mixed hope and terror in equal measure. Thomas recognized that look. He had seen it on the faces of mail-order brides before, women who had traveled across the country to marry men they had never met, gambling everything on letters and promises that might turn out to be lies. Thomas took a step forward without thinking, drawn by an impulse he could not name. The woman's gaze swept past him, searching, and then her face went pale beneath the bruises. Thomas followed her line of sight and saw Cyrus Blackwell emerging from the Silver Spur saloon, adjusting his hat with the self-satisfied air of a man who believed the world owed him deference. Blackwell was a cattle buyer who had made himself wealthy through deals that often left ranchers feeling cheated, though nothing could ever be proven. He was in his mid-40s, thick around the middle, with small eyes that never seemed to reflect warmth. Thomas had dealt with him once, and had vowed never to do so again, preferring to drive his cattle an extra 50 miles to a different buyer rather than shake Blackwell's clammy hand. The woman took an involuntary step backward, nearly stumbling on the coach step, and Thomas was moving before he made a conscious decision to do so. He crossed the distance between them in long strides, his boots kicking up little clouds of Montana dust, and reached her side just as she steadied herself. "Ma'am," Thomas said, keeping his voice gentle despite the anger simmering in his blood. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest. Her eyes were the color of mountain twilight, deep purple blue and luminous, despite the fear in them. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with dark hair that curled at her temples, despite being pulled back in a severe bun. Even with the bruises marring her face, Thomas could see she was beautiful, but it was not her beauty that held him. It was the courage he saw fighting with the fear, the determination in the set of her jaw, despite the trembling of her hands. "I am managing, thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady, with an accent that spoke of education and a place far from Montana. The East Coast, Thomas guessed, maybe Boston or Philadelphia. "Eleanor!" Cyrus Blackwell's voice cut across the street like a whip crack. "There you are, my dear. I hope your journey was not too taxing." Thomas saw the woman, Eleanor, flinch at Blackwell's voice, saw the way her knuckles went white on the handle of her carpet bag. Every instinct Thomas possessed screamed that something was wrong, that this woman needed help, that he could not simply stand by and watch her walk toward whatever fate Blackwell had planned for her. "Mr. Blackwell," Eleanor said, and Thomas heard the effort it cost her to keep her voice level. "I have arrived as promised." Blackwell reached them, and Thomas caught the smell of whiskey and stale cigars rolling off the man. Blackwell's eyes swept over Eleanor with a proprietary gleam that made Thomas's hands curl into fists, and then those small eyes fixed on Thomas with irritation. "Mercer," Blackwell said flatly, "I do not recall requiring your assistance." "I was offering the lady a steadying hand," Thomas replied, keeping his tone carefully neutral. "The coach steps can be treacherous." "My fiancé does not need the assistance of a dirt-poor rancher," Blackwell said, reaching for Eleanor's arm. "Come along, Eleanor. I have arranged the rooms at the hotel." Eleanor did not move, and Thomas saw her entire body go rigid. For a long moment, the three of them stood frozen in a tableau that drew curious glances from the townspeople going about their business. Then Eleanor raised her chin, and Thomas saw something shift in her expression. saw her make a decision that took every ounce of courage she possessed. "Mr. Blackwell," Eleanor said quietly, "I cannot marry you." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of consequence spreading outward. Blackwell's face darkened, his jaw clenching, and Thomas saw his hand tighten on Eleanor's arm hard enough to make her gasp. "We will discuss this in private," Blackwell hissed, trying to pull Eleanor toward the hotel. "Let her go." Thomas's voice came out low and dangerous, the tone he used on wolves circling his calves. His hand moved to rest on Eleanor's shoulder, gentle but unmistakably protective. Blackwell's eyes snapped to Thomas, rage boiling in them. "This is none of your concern, Mercer. This woman is my intended bride. We have a contract." "A contract signed under false pretenses," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but determined. "You told me you were a widower seeking companionship. You never mentioned that your first wife died under suspicious circumstances, or that you have a reputation for violence. Your last letter arrived 3 weeks ago, and the things you wrote—" Her voice broke, and Thomas saw tears gathering in those twilight eyes. "I would rather starve on these streets than marry you, Mr. Blackwell." Thomas felt the world narrow to this moment, to this woman's courage and the choice he was about to make. He knew what it would cost him to involve himself in this situation. Blackwell had influence in Montana territory, connections that could make Thomas's life difficult. But as he looked at Eleanor's bruised face and heard the desperate conviction in her voice, Thomas knew he could not walk away. "The lady has made her position clear," Thomas said. "I suggest you respect it." "And who is going to make me?" Blackwell sneered. "You? Everyone knows your ranch is one bad season away from foreclosure, Mercer. You cannot afford to make enemies." "Some things matter more than money," Thomas replied. He looked down at Eleanor, meeting her eyes. "Ma'am, if you need somewhere safe to stay while you figure out your next step, my ranch has a spare room. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, would be happy to have another woman around. No strings attached, no expectations. Just a safe place until you decide what you want to do." Eleanor stared at him as if he had spoken a foreign language. "You do not even know me. Why would you help me?" Thomas thought about how to answer that question. He could not explain the certainty that had taken root in his chest, the knowledge that letting this woman walk away with Blackwell would haunt him for the rest of his life. So he settled for a simple truth. "Because you need help," he said, "and because I can see you are a good person in a bad situation. That is enough." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, and she nodded once, quickly. "Yes, thank you. I accept your offer." Blackwell's face went mottled with rage. "You will regret this, both of you. Eleanor, you signed a contract. You owe me the money I spent bringing you here." "Send me a bill," Thomas said calmly. "I will pay her traveling expenses. Now, step aside, Blackwell." For a moment, Thomas thought the man might actually take a swing at him. Blackwell's fists clenched, his breathing heavy, and Thomas prepared himself for a fight. But Blackwell was a bully, and bullies back down when confronted with real opposition. After a long, tense moment, Blackwell stepped back. "This is not over," Blackwell said, jabbing a finger at Thomas. "You have made a powerful enemy today, Mercer." "I will survive," Thomas said. He offered Eleanor his arm, and after a heartbeat of hesitation, she took it. Thomas could feel her trembling through the fabric of his shirt, but she walked beside him with her head high as they moved toward where his wagon waited at the end of the street. They were halfway there when Eleanor stumbled, her knees buckling. Thomas caught her before she could fall, and she looked up at him with eyes that were suddenly unfocused. "I apologize," she whispered. "I have not eaten since yesterday morning. The money I had left was barely enough for the coach fare." Anger flared hot in Thomas's chest again, but he kept it off his face. "When did Blackwell do that to your face?" Eleanor's hand rose unconsciously to touch her bruised cheek. "He came to Philadelphia 2 weeks ago. He wanted to—" She swallowed hard. "He wanted to ensure I would be a suitable wife. When I tried to leave, when I saw what kind of man he truly was, he locked me in my rented room. He said I had taken his money and I would fulfill our contract, or he would see me arrested for theft. 3 days ago, I managed to escape through the window. I had already given up my teaching position, sold everything I owned to pay debts my father left when he died. I had nowhere else to go, so I came here thinking perhaps I could reason with him, make him understand I could not marry him. But when I saw him just now, You saw a man who would make your life a nightmare, Thomas finished grimly. He guided her gently toward the wagon. Come on, let's get some food in you, and then we will get you to the ranch. The wagon ride to Thomas's ranch took an hour, and Eleanor spent the first 20 minutes eating the bread and cheese Thomas bought from the general store, with the kind of desperate hunger that broke his heart. When she finally finished, she looked at him with gratitude and wariness mixed in her expression. You must think me terribly foolish, she said quietly, agreeing to marry a stranger based on letters. I think you were in a difficult situation and made the best choice you could with the information you had, Thomas replied, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. That does not make you foolish. It makes you human. My father was a professor, Eleanor said, her voice distant with memory. He taught literature at the university in Philadelphia. When he died 6 months ago, I discovered he had gambling debts I never knew about. They took everything, the house, the furniture, his books. I was left with nothing but a teaching position that paid barely enough for a tiny room and 1 meal a day. When Mr. Blackwell's advertisement appeared in the newspaper, seeking an educated wife for companionship and partnership in the Montana Territory, it seemed like a chance at a new life. His letters were eloquent and kind. He wrote about the beauty of the mountains, the growing towns, the opportunities in the West. He seemed like a gentleman. Blackwell is good at seeming like things he is not, Thomas said. That is how he has built his business. I was so desperate to believe him, Eleanor said, and Thomas heard the self-recrimination in her voice. I wanted to believe there was somewhere I could start over, be something more than a poor woman struggling to survive in a city that had nothing left for me. Thomas was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. You are still that person, he said, the one who wants a new start. Blackwell may have lied about who he was, but Montana is still here. The opportunities are still real. You just need time to find your footing. Eleanor looked at him with those remarkable eyes. Why are you being so kind to me? You do not know anything about me except what I have told you, which could all be lies. Could be, Thomas agreed. But I do not think it is. I have gotten pretty good at reading people in my years out here. You have to be when your life might depend on knowing whether a man is trustworthy or dangerous, and everything about you tells me you are telling the truth. What if Mr. Blackwell tries to cause trouble for you? Let me worry about Blackwell, Thomas said, his jaw tightening. He is a coward who preys on people weaker than himself. He will bluster and threaten, but he will not do anything that might bring real consequences down on him. You cannot be certain of that. No, Thomas admitted, but I am certain that I did the right thing, and I will deal with whatever comes. They fell into silence as the wagon rolled along the dirt road that led to Thomas's ranch. The landscape stretched out around them in shades of gold and green, with the mountains rising blue and majestic in the distance. The sky was so big out here, so vast and endless, that it made a person feel both insignificant and strangely free. The Mercer ranch came into view as they crested a low hill, and Thomas felt the usual mix of pride and anxiety he experienced whenever he saw his land. The main house was modest but well built, constructed from timber and stone by his father 20 years earlier. The barn was sturdy, the corrals in good repair, and the few hundred head of cattle grazing in the pasture represented years of careful breeding and hard work. It was not a grand spread like some of the bigger operations to the south, but it was his, bought with his father's sweat and maintained through Thomas's determination. Mrs. Chen was hanging laundry when the wagon pulled into the yard, and she looked up with surprise that shifted quickly to concern when she saw Eleanor. Mrs. Chen was a small, sturdy woman in her 50s, who had come to Montana with her husband during the gold rush 20 years earlier. When her husband died in a mining accident, she had stayed, refusing to return to China or move to one of the larger Chinese communities in California. She had been keeping house for Thomas for 5 years now, and he trusted her more than anyone else in the territory. Thomas, Mrs. Chen said, her sharp eyes taking in Eleanor's bruises and pale face. What has happened? Mrs. Chen, this is Miss Eleanor. Thomas paused, realizing he did not know Eleanor's last name. Hartley, Eleanor supplied quietly. Eleanor Hartley. Miss Hartley arrived today to marry Cyrus Blackwell, but she has decided against that plan. She needs a safe place to stay for a while. I offered her our spare room. Mrs. Chen's expression went carefully neutral, in the way it did when she was thinking hard about something. Then she nodded once, decisively. "Of course. Come, Miss Hartley. You look exhausted. Let me show you to your room, and then I will prepare a proper meal." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon with Thomas's assistance, and he saw her wince as her feet hit the ground. She was probably bruised in places he could not see, injuries Blackwell had inflicted during those days he had held her prisoner in Philadelphia. The rage that thought provoked made Thomas's vision go red for a moment, and he had to take a deep breath to steady himself. He was not a violent man by nature, but the idea of Blackwell putting his hands on Eleanor in anger made Thomas want to ride back to Sweetwater and teach the man a lesson about hitting women. Mrs. Chen must have seen something in his face because she gave him a warning look as she guided Eleanor toward the house. "Thomas, the fence in the east pasture needs attention. Why do you not go take care of that while I get Miss Hartley settled?" Thomas understood the dismissal for what it was. Mrs. Chen giving him time to get his temper under control and giving Eleanor space to settle in without a strange man hovering. He nodded, tipped his hat to Eleanor, and headed toward the barn to collect tools. The next few hours passed in the familiar rhythm of ranch work. Thomas rode out to the east pasture and found 3 fence posts that had rotted through, probably weakened by the harsh winter, and finished off by the spring rains. He dug new post holes, set new posts, and strung fresh wire, losing himself in the physical labor. The sun beat down on his shoulders, and sweat soaked through his shirt, but the work settled something in him, gave him time to think through the situation he had just gotten himself into. He had invited a woman he did not know to live on his ranch, a woman who was running from a dangerous man, a woman whose bruised face and courageous eyes had stirred something in Thomas that he had thought long dead. Thomas had been in love once, 6 years ago, with a girl named Sarah who had lived in Sweetwater. She had been pretty and sweet, and Thomas had been planning to propose when she announced she was leaving Montana to marry a banker in Denver. She had told Thomas gently but firmly that she could not be a rancher's wife, could not handle the isolation and hardship of life on a cattle ranch. Thomas had let her go without argument, had watched her board the stagecoach with her dreams of city life and security, and had turned his attention back to his land. Since then, he had concentrated on building his ranch, on surviving the hard years and making the most of the good ones. He had told himself he did not have time for romance, that the ranch needed all his attention. But the truth, Thomas acknowledged as he hammered in another fence post, was that Sarah's rejection had hurt more than he wanted to admit, had made him wary of opening his heart again. Now, here was Eleanor, dropped into his life like a storm sweeping down from the mountains, and Thomas could not deny the pull he felt toward her. It was not just her beauty, though she was lovely even with the bruises. It was her courage, the way she had stood up to Blackwell despite her fear. It was the determination in her voice when she said she would rather starve than marry a man she knew would hurt her. It was the way she had looked at Thomas when he offered her help, as if he had offered her the moon and stars. Thomas was not naive enough to think Eleanor felt anything for him beyond gratitude. She was traumatized and desperate, and he was simply the first person to offer her kindness. But something had shifted in Thomas when he saw her step off that stagecoach, and he knew his life had just become infinitely more complicated. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Thomas finally rode back to the ranch house. He could smell cooking as he approached, the rich scent of beef stew and fresh bread that made his stomach growl. He took care of his horse first, as he always did, brushing the animal down and making sure there was feed and water before heading to the pump outside the barn to wash off the worst of the dirt and sweat. When Thomas entered the kitchen through the back door, he found Mrs. Chen stirring a pot on the stove and Eleanor sitting at the table, peeling potatoes with practiced efficiency. Eleanor had changed into a simple gray dress that Thomas recognized as one of Mrs. Chen's, and she had unpinned her hair so it fell in dark waves around her shoulders. Someone had tended to her injuries. There was salve on her lip and a clean bandage on a cut above her eyebrow that Thomas had not noticed before. Eleanor looked up when Thomas entered, and for a moment their eyes met across the kitchen. Thomas saw something flicker in her expression, awareness perhaps, or nervousness, and he was suddenly conscious of how he must look, dusty and sweaty from a day's work, his shirt sticking to his back. "Miss Hartley," Thomas said, removing his hat, "I hope you are feeling better." "Much better, thank you," Eleanor replied. Her voice was still soft, but there was more strength in it than there had been that afternoon. "Mrs. Chen has been very kind, and please call me Eleanor. After everything you have done for me, Formality seems unnecessary. Then you should call me Thomas, he said. He glanced at Mrs. Chen, who was watching the interaction with interest barely concealed on her weathered face. Dinner smells wonderful, Mrs. Chen. It will be ready in 20 minutes, Mrs. Chen said. Thomas, go wash properly. You cannot sit at my table smelling like horse and hard work. Thomas grinned despite himself. Yes, ma'am. He retreated to his room to change into clean clothes and wash with the basin and pitcher there, scrubbing until he felt presentably clean. Dinner that night was a strange affair, full of careful politeness and unspoken questions. Eleanor ate with better appetite than she had shown on the road, and Thomas was glad to see some color returning to her face. Mrs. Chen kept the conversation flowing, asking Eleanor about Philadelphia and her teaching work, sharing stories about life in Montana Territory that made Eleanor's eyes widen with a mix of fascination and apprehension. Is it true there are still conflicts with the native tribes? Eleanor asked at one point, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. Some, Thomas said carefully, mostly further west and south. The Crow and Blackfeet around here have treaties with the government, though those treaties are not always honored the way they should be. There is tension, but it is not like it was 10 or 15 years ago. For the most part, folks live and let live. Though you should be aware that not everyone shares that attitude, Mrs. Chen added. There are those who believe the native people should be driven out entirely, and those who take advantage of the situation to steal land or cause trouble. It is a complicated situation. Eleanor nodded slowly, absorbing this information. Everything here is so different from what I knew. Philadelphia was crowded and dirty and sometimes dangerous. But it was a kind of danger I understood. This feels like a different world entirely. It is, Thomas agreed. For better and worse. Life is harder here in some ways. The land does not forgive mistakes, and you cannot always rely on having neighbors close by to help in trouble. But there is also freedom here that you cannot find in the cities. A chance to build something entirely your own, to live by your own rules. Is that why you stay? Eleanor asked, looking at him with genuine curiosity. The freedom? Thomas considered the question. Partly, but mostly I stay because this land is in my blood. My father came here when Montana was still wild territory, when there was nothing here but grass and sky and possibility. He built this ranch from nothing, carved a life out of wilderness with his bare hands. When he died, I inherited more than just land and cattle. I inherited his dream, his vision of what this place could be. I cannot walk away from that. Something in Eleanor's expression softened. You loved him very much. I did, Thomas said. He was a hard man, but fair. He taught me everything I know about ranching, about living out here. I wish he could have lived to see the ranch really thrive. He died the winter I turned 19, during a blizzard when he was trying to save stranded cattle. Sometimes I think, if I can make this ranch successful, truly successful, then his death will have meant something. The words hung in the air between them, more honest than Thomas had meant to be. He was not usually one to share his feelings so openly, especially not with someone he had just met. But something about Eleanor made him want to be honest, made him feel safe in ways he had not felt in years. I understand, Eleanor said quietly. When my father died, I felt as if I had lost my anchor in the world. He was brilliant but impractical, always living in his books and his ideas. I spent years trying to manage our household finances, trying to keep us afloat while he pursued his research and his teaching. When he died and I discovered the debts, I felt angry and lost and guilty all at once. Angry that he had been so careless, lost without his presence, guilty for feeling angry at a dead man I had loved. Thomas reached across the table without thinking, covering her hand with his. You have nothing to feel guilty about. Love does not mean pretending someone was perfect. It means seeing their flaws and loving them anyway. Eleanor's eyes met his, and Thomas felt the pull again, that sense of connection that went deeper than logic or reason. Her hand was small and warm under his, and he could feel the calluses on her fingers that spoke of hard work, of a gentlewoman forced by circumstances to become something tougher. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat delicately, and Thomas pulled his hand back, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment. Eleanor's cheeks had flushed pink, and she ducked her head, focusing on her dinner with unnecessary concentration. The rest of the meal passed in lighter conversation, and when it was finished, Eleanor insisted on helping with the dishes despite both Thomas and Mrs. Chen protesting. They worked together in comfortable near silence, Thomas drying while Eleanor washed and Mrs. Chen put things away, and it felt strangely domestic, strangely right. That night, lying in his bed listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling around him, Thomas found himself thinking about Eleanor sleeping in the room down the hall. He wondered if she was comfortable, if the bed was soft enough, if the unfamiliar sounds of the Montana night kept her awake. He wondered what she was thinking, if she was relieved to be safe or terrified about what came next. Most of all, Thomas wondered what he was going to do about the feelings growing in his chest, the desire to protect her that was rapidly becoming something deeper and more complicated. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and surreal. Eleanor proved herself to be capable and hardworking, refusing to simply accept Thomas's charity without contributing. She helped Mrs. Chen with the cooking and cleaning, tended a vegetable garden that was producing its summer bounty, and even helped with some of the lighter ranch chores. Thomas watched her adapt to ranch life with determination, seeing her gradually lose the haunted look that had shadowed her eyes those first few days. They ate their meals together, the three of them, and slowly Eleanor began to share more about her life in Philadelphia. She told them about her teaching work, about the students she had loved, and the satisfaction of seeing young minds expand with knowledge. She told them about her father's obsession with medieval literature, how he would recite Chaucer and Shakespeare at the dinner table until Eleanor had those words carved into her memory. She told them about the small pleasures of city life, concerts in the park, museums full of art and history, libraries that smelled of old paper and possibility. In turn, Thomas and Mrs. Chen shared their own stories. Mrs. Chen talked about her husband, about the hope that had brought them to America and the dreams that had died in that mine collapse. She talked about choosing to stay in Montana anyway, about building a new life from the pieces of her broken dreams. Thomas told Eleanor about growing up on the ranch, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the harsh winters and the satisfaction of seeing calves born in the spring. Thomas found himself looking for excuses to be around Eleanor, to see her smile or hear her laugh. He watched her face light up when she discovered wildflowers growing near the creek, saw her delight when one of the barn cats had kittens and she was allowed to name them. He saw her gradually shed the fear that Blackwell had planted in her, saw her start to believe that she was truly safe here. But Thomas also saw the moments when doubt crept into her eyes, when she would catch him looking at her and a troubled expression would cross her face. He knew she was wondering about his motives, about what he expected in return for his help. The knowledge that she might see him as another man trying to manipulate her for his own ends cut deep. But Thomas forced himself to be patient. Trust had to be earned, especially from someone who had been betrayed as thoroughly as Eleanor had. On a warm evening in early August, Thomas came back to the ranch house after a long day checking on cattle in the far pastures to find Eleanor sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. She had a book open in her lap, one of the few possessions she had brought with her from Philadelphia, but she was not reading. Instead, she stared at the horizon with an expression that was part wonder, part melancholy. Thomas hesitated, not wanting to intrude on her solitude, but Eleanor looked up and saw him. She smiled, and Thomas felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. "The sunsets here are extraordinary," Eleanor said, as Thomas climbed the porch steps. "I never saw anything like this in Philadelphia. The buildings always block the view." "It is one of the things I love most about this place," Thomas agreed, settling into the chair beside her. "No matter how hard the day has been, watching the sun go down reminds me why I am here." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the light fade. Then Eleanor spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Thomas, I need to talk to you about something that has been weighing on me." Thomas felt his stomach tighten with apprehension, but he kept his voice steady. "Of course. What is it?" Eleanor set her book aside and turned to face him fully. "You have been extraordinarily kind to me, you and Mrs. Chen both. You have given me shelter and safety and asked for nothing in return. But I cannot continue to impose on your generosity indefinitely. I need to find a way to support myself, to make my own way here." "You are not imposing," Thomas started, but Eleanor held up a hand. "Please, let me finish. I have been thinking about this a great deal. I am a trained teacher, and I have heard you mention that Sweetwater does not have a proper school. The children are taught by whoever has time and inclination, with no consistency or formal curriculum. I would like to start a school, a real one, with regular hours and structured lessons. I know I would need to find a building, and I have no money to rent one, but perhaps I could work out some kind of arrangement." "The old church," Thomas interrupted, his mind racing. "The one on the edge of town. It has not been used for services in 2 years, not since Reverend Thompson died, and his replacement decided to build a new church closer to the center of town. The building just sits there empty. I am certain the town council would be willing to let you use it for a school." Eleanor's eyes lit up with hope. "Do you really think so?" "I think the people of Sweetwater would be grateful to have someone qualified teaching their children," Thomas said. "And I know you would be an excellent teacher. I have watched you explain things to Mrs. Chen and me, seen how patient you are, how clearly you communicate. You have a gift for it. But even if I could secure the building, I would need supplies, books, slates, paper, and I would need to live somewhere in town, which means renting a room." "You could continue living here," Thomas said, the words tumbling out before he could think them through. "It is only an hour by wagon to town. I could drive you in the morning and pick you up in the evening, at least until you saved enough money to afford your own transportation." Eleanor stared at him, and Thomas saw the conflict in her expression. "Thomas, that is too much. You have already done so much. I cannot ask you to rearrange your entire schedule for me." "You are not asking. I am offering." Thomas leaned forward, searching for the words to make her understand. "Eleanor, having you here has been—" He paused, trying to find the right way to say this. "You have brought something to this ranch that has been missing for a long time. Laughter, conversation that goes beyond cattle prices and fence repairs. A sense that this place is a home, not just a piece of land I happen to work. Mrs. Chen feels it too. I would be grateful if you stayed, not as a charity case, but as someone who belongs here." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes, catching the last light of the sunset. "You make it sound so simple." "Maybe it is," Thomas said. "Maybe we complicate things by overthinking them. You need a place to stay and a way to make a living. I have a place and can help you get the teaching position established. Why not accept the help?" "Because I am afraid," Eleanor whispered, the words breaking on the last syllable. "I am afraid that I am becoming too comfortable here, too dependent on you. I am afraid that I am misreading your kindness as something more, and that I will make a fool of myself. I am afraid that Cyrus Blackwell will somehow find a way to hurt you for helping me, and it will be my fault. I am afraid of so many things, Thomas, and I do not know how to stop being afraid." Thomas did something he had wanted to do for weeks. He reached out and took Eleanor's hand, holding it gently between both of his. "Fear is not weakness, Eleanor. Fear is your mind trying to protect you from being hurt again. But fear also keeps us from living fully, from taking the chances that might lead to something wonderful. I am not going to lie to you and say there is no risk in staying here, in starting a school, in building a life in Montana. Blackwell might try to cause trouble. The school might fail. 100 things could go wrong, but they might also go right." "What do you want from me?" Eleanor asked, her voice raw with vulnerability. "Please be honest. I need to know what you expect." Thomas held her gaze, making sure she could see the truth in his eyes. "Right now, I want you to feel safe. I want you to have time to heal from what Blackwell did to you, to find your footing in this new life. Beyond that," he took a breath, committing to honesty. "Beyond that, I would like the chance to know you better, to see if this connection I feel between us is real or just circumstances throwing us together. But I will never pressure you, Eleanor. You are free to leave whenever you choose. You are free to stay and keep things exactly as they are now, as friends and nothing more. Whatever you need, I will respect that." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting in his. Then she squeezed his fingers gently. "I would like to stay, and I would like the chance to know you better too. But I need time, Thomas. I need to prove to myself that I can stand on my own, that I am not just running from one man's protection to another's." "Take all the time you need," Thomas said, even though part of him wanted to pull her into his arms and promise her the world. "I am not going anywhere." They sat together on the porch until the stars came out, hands linked, watching the night settle over the ranch. And Thomas felt something that had been tight in his chest for 6 years finally start to loosen. Felt hope beginning to bloom like wildflowers after rain. The next week, Thomas drove Eleanor into Sweetwater to meet with the town council about using the old church as a school. Thomas had spoken with several council members beforehand, laying the groundwork, and the meeting went better than he had dared to hope. The councilmen were enthusiastic about having a formal school, and they agreed to let Eleanor use the building rent-free for the first year in exchange for teaching their children. They even agreed to help fund basic supplies, though Eleanor would need to be creative about making resources stretch. As they left the meeting, Eleanor was practically glowing with excitement. They said yes! They actually said yes! I can start teaching in September when the harvest is finished, and families can spare their children for lessons. I never doubted it, Thomas said, though in truth, he had worried that some of the councilmen might object to a woman who had been associated with Cyrus Blackwell, however briefly. But Eleanor's education and qualifications had won them over, and her passion for teaching had been evident in every word she spoke. They were walking toward the wagon, Eleanor chattering about curriculum plans and how she would organize the different age groups when a voice cut across the street. Well, well, if it is not Miss Hartley and her rescuer. Thomas turned to find Cyrus Blackwell standing outside the saloon, a sneer on his fleshy face. Thomas felt Eleanor go rigid beside him, felt her hand tighten on his arm. Blackwell, Thomas said evenly, I have nothing to say to you. But I have something to say to you, Blackwell replied, stepping into the street. Thomas noticed he had two men with him, rough-looking types who probably worked as hired muscle. I have been hearing interesting things, Mercer, hearing that you are setting yourself up as quite the hero, rescuing poor, defenseless women and giving them shelter in your home. Makes a man wonder what you are getting in return for your generosity. The implication in Blackwell's words was clear and disgusting. Thomas felt rage surge through him, hot and dangerous, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper was exactly what Blackwell wanted. Mind your tongue, Blackwell, Thomas said, his voice low and hard. You are speaking about a lady. A lady? Blackwell laughed, an ugly sound. Is that what she told you? Did she mention that she signed a contract with me? That she took my money and then ran off like a thief? Did she tell you about the debts her father owed? About how desperate she was for any man who would take her? That is enough, Eleanor's voice rang out, sharp and clear. Thomas felt her step forward, putting herself between him and Blackwell, and his heart clenched with fear for her. But Eleanor stood tall, her chin raised, and when she spoke, her voice did not waver. You want to spread lies about me, Mr. Blackwell? Then let me tell everyone the truth. You presented yourself as a respectable widower, seeking a companion. You wrote me letters full of poetry and promises. But when you came to Philadelphia, I saw who you really are. You are a bully and a brute who believes money gives you the right to treat people like property. You locked me in my room and told me I had no choice but to marry you. You put these marks on my face. She gestured to the fading bruises. Because I dared to say no to you. So, yes, I ran. I broke our contract because it was based on your lies, and I have no regrets about that choice. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. Thomas saw shopkeepers and townspeople watching with fascination, saw women whispering behind their hands and men frowning at Blackwell. Eleanor's speech had been delivered with such conviction, such obvious truth, that no one could doubt her words. Blackwell's face had gone purple with rage. You little... He started toward Eleanor, his hand raised, and Thomas moved without thinking. He stepped in front of Eleanor and caught Blackwell's wrist in mid-swing. You will not touch her, Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. You will not speak to her. You will turn around and walk away, and you will stay away from her. If I ever hear that you have tried to contact her or harm her in any way, I will make sure every rancher in Montana Territory knows exactly what kind of man you are. How you beat women and hold them prisoner. How your first wife died under suspicious circumstances. I will make it so that no honest man will do business with you ever again. For a long moment, the two men stood locked in silent combat, Thomas gripping Blackwell's wrist hard enough to leave marks. Then Blackwell jerked away, his small eyes glittering with malice. This is not over, Mercer, Blackwell hissed. You have made an enemy today. You made an enemy when you put your hands on Eleanor, Thomas replied. Now get out of my sight. Blackwell looked around at the watching crowd, seeming to realize that public opinion had turned against him. With a final venomous glare, he turned and stalked back toward the saloon, his hired men following. Thomas turned to Eleanor, his heart pounding. Are you all right? Eleanor was shaking, but there was triumph in her eyes. I am better than all right. For the first time since this nightmare began, I feel like I have taken control of my own story. I told the truth, and people believed me. Thomas wanted to pull her into his arms, to hold her until the shaking stopped, but he was aware of all the eyes still watching them. Instead, he offered her his arm again. "Let's go home." As they climbed into the wagon and started the drive back to the ranch, Thomas could not shake the feeling that Blackwell's threat had been more than empty bluster. The man had been humiliated in front of the town, his reputation damaged by Eleanor's public accusation. Men like Blackwell did not forgive that kind of slight. Thomas resolved to be more careful, to watch for signs of trouble. He would not let Blackwell hurt Eleanor, no matter what it cost him. The rest of August passed in a flurry of activity. Eleanor threw herself into preparing for the school, and Thomas found himself drawn into her enthusiasm. They cleaned the old church building together, scrubbing years of dust from the windows and floors, patching holes in the roof, building rough desks from scrap lumber. Mrs. Chen sewed cushions for the seats and made curtains for the windows. The town donated slates and chalk, a few precious books, and a battered globe that had seen better days. Working side by side with Eleanor, Thomas found himself falling deeper under her spell. He loved watching her face light up when she planned lessons, loved hearing her talk about the subjects she would teach. He loved her determination and her intelligence, the way she could discuss philosophy one moment and then laugh at herself the next when she hit her thumb with a hammer. They talked for hours while they worked, conversations that ranged from the trivial to the profound. Eleanor told him about books she had read and places she dreamed of visiting. Thomas told her about the land, about the cycle of seasons on a ranch, about his hopes of expanding his herd and maybe one day breeding horses as well as cattle. They argued playfully about whether city life or country life was superior, whether Shakespeare or the classical poets were more worthy of study, whether apple pie or berry cobbler was the superior dessert. Through it all, Thomas felt the connection between them deepening, felt the walls around his heart crumbling. He caught himself thinking about Eleanor at odd moments during the day, found himself making excuses to ride back to the ranch house just to see her smile. He lay awake at night, remembering the sound of her laughter, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she was amused, the graceful way her hands moved when she was animated about something. But Thomas held himself back from declaring his feelings, remembering Eleanor's words about needing time to prove herself independent. He did not want to pressure her or make her feel obligated, so he kept his growing love locked behind his teeth and tried to be content with friendship. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn gold in the aspen trees. The school opened its doors on a crisp Monday morning, and 14 children of varying ages showed up for Eleanor's first day of teaching. Thomas drove her to town that morning and saw the mix of nerves and excitement in her eyes. "You are going to be wonderful," he told her as she gathered her materials. "What if they do not listen to me? What if I have forgotten how to teach? What if—" Thomas took her hands, stopping the flow of worried words. "Eleanor, those children are lucky to have you. You are going to change their lives by giving them education and opportunity. Trust yourself." Eleanor took a deep breath and nodded. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." Thomas watched her walk into the church-turned schoolhouse with her head high and her shoulders squared, and he felt so much pride and affection that it was almost painful. Then he turned the wagon toward the ranch and tried to focus on his own work. The routine they established worked well. Thomas drove Eleanor to town each morning and picked her up each afternoon. Eleanor would talk excitedly about her students on the drive home, sharing stories about their progress and their personalities. Little Michael, who could barely read but showed aptitude for mathematics. Sarah and Samuel, twins who competed over everything. Emma, the oldest girl, who absorbed every lesson like a sponge and asked questions that challenged Eleanor to think deeply about her subject matter. The weeks rolled by, September turning to October, and the aspen trees blazing gold across the mountainsides. Thomas's cattle were healthy and fat heading into winter, and the ranch was in better shape than it had been in years. Eleanor's school was thriving, with parents praising her methods and children actually excited to attend lessons. Everything seemed to be going perfectly, which should have warned Thomas that trouble was coming. It arrived on a cold October morning when Thomas went to the barn to start his day's work and found one of the horses dead in its stall. The animal had been healthy the night before, but now it lay stiff and cold, foam dried around its mouth. Poison, Thomas realized with sick dread. Someone had poisoned his horse. He found Mrs. Chen in the kitchen and told her what had happened, keeping his voice low so Eleanor would not hear from her room, where she was getting ready for the day. "Blackwell," Mrs. Chen said immediately. "It has to be." "I think so too, but I cannot prove it," Thomas said grimly. "And without proof—" "You need to be careful," Mrs. Chen interrupted. "A man who will poison a horse might do worse." Thomas nodded, his mind racing. He could not let Eleanor know about this. She would blame herself, might even decide to leave to protect him. But he also could not ignore the threat. Blackwell was escalating. Over the next 2 weeks, more incidents occurred. Fence lines were cut, letting cattle wander onto neighboring land. The barn door was left open one night, and it was only by luck that the remaining horses did not escape. Thomas found evidence that someone had been watching the ranch house at night. Footprints in the mud outside Eleanor's window that made his blood run cold. Thomas started sleeping in the barn, his rifle within easy reach. He hired 2 ranch hands he trusted to help keep watch and to do the work that he was now too preoccupied to handle. But he could not be everywhere at once, and Blackwell seemed to know it. The situation came to a head on a cold evening in late October. Thomas had just picked Eleanor up from school, and they were driving back to the ranch when they rounded a bend in the road and found Blackwell waiting, sitting on horseback with 4 hired men flanking him. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle under the seat. "Move aside, Blackwell." "I do not think so," Blackwell said, his voice oily with false pleasantness. "You see, Mercer, you have cost me a great deal. Miss Hartley's little speech in town damaged my reputation. Several business relationships have become strained. I have decided that it is time I received compensation for my troubles." "We have nothing to give you," Thomas said, keeping his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. 5 against 1 were bad odds, especially with Eleanor in the wagon. "Oh, I think you do," Blackwell said. He nudged his horse forward, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. "She is going to come with me. We have unfinished business, she and I. And you are not going to try to stop me, because if you do, my men will make sure you never ranch again. We will burn your house, scatter your cattle, destroy everything you have built. Is one woman worth that, Mercer?" Thomas felt Eleanor trembling beside him, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I will not go with you. You cannot force me." "I think I can," Blackwell said, and gestured to his men. They started to dismount, moving toward the wagon. Thomas's mind raced, calculating angles and odds. He could probably take down 2 of them before they overwhelmed him, but that would leave Eleanor defenseless. He needed help, The crack of a rifle shot split the air, and dirt exploded near the hooves of Blackwell's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing Blackwell, and the hired men froze. "I suggest you gentlemen move along," a voice called from the rocks above the road. Thomas looked up and felt relief flood through him. Sheriff Ben Morrison stood on the outcropping, his rifle aimed at Blackwell. Behind him were 3 deputized townsmen, also armed. "Sheriff," Blackwell said, fighting to control his frightened horse. "This is not your concern. Threatening people on public roads is absolutely my concern," Morrison replied. "I have been hearing rumors about you, Blackwell. Hearing that you have been causing trouble for Thomas Mercer's ranch. Hearing that you have been making threats against Miss Hartley. Now I find you blocking the road with hired guns. That is enough for me to arrest you for harassment and attempted assault." "You cannot prove anything," Blackwell blustered. "Maybe not, but I can escort you back to town and make sure you stay there, and I can make it known that I am keeping an eye on you. Any more trouble at the Mercer Ranch, and I will know exactly where to look." Morrison climbed down from the rocks, his deputies following. "Now, are you going to come peacefully, or do we have to do this the hard way?" Blackwell looked around at his hired men, but they were already backing away, not willing to fight the law. With fury twisting his features, Blackwell jerked his horse around. "This is not finished," he spat at Thomas and Eleanor. "Actually, it is," Sheriff Morrison said. "And Blackwell, if anything happens to these folks, I am coming for you. I do not care how many connections you have or how much money you wave around. I will see you hang. We clear?" Blackwell did not answer, just spurred his horse into a gallop, his men scrambling to follow. Thomas let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Ben, how did you—" "Mrs. Chen came to town this morning," Morrison said, walking over to the wagon. "Told me about the horse and the cut fences. I figured Blackwell might try something, so I have been keeping watch. Good thing, too. He tipped his hat to Eleanor. "Miss Hartley, I apologize that you have had to deal with this." "Thank you, Sheriff," Eleanor said, her voice shaking now that the danger had passed. "I am grateful you arrived when you did." "Just doing my job, ma'am." Morrison looked at Thomas. "Blackwell is not going to give up, not completely. But I think after today he will realize that coming after you openly is too risky. He is the type who operates in shadows. Bring him into the light, and he loses his power." Thomas nodded, sliding an arm around Eleanor's shoulders as she began to shake harder. "I appreciate your help, Ben." "Anytime. Now get Miss Hartley home. She has had enough excitement for one day." The drive back to the ranch was silent. Eleanor huddled against Thomas's side, his arm holding her steady. When they reached the house, Mrs. Chen took one look at them and immediately prepared hot tea and food. Thomas guided Eleanor to a chair by the fire and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "I am so sorry," Eleanor whispered, tears starting to slide down her cheeks. "This is all my fault. If I had never come here, if I had just married him like I was supposed to—" "Do not," Thomas said fiercely, kneeling in front of her chair and taking her cold hands in his. "Do not apologize for refusing to be a victim. Do not apologize for choosing freedom over slavery, because that is what marriage to Blackwell would have been. None of this is your fault, Eleanor. The only person to blame is Blackwell himself." "But he is targeting you because of me. Your horse, your ranch—" "Can be replaced or repaired," Thomas interrupted. "You cannot. Your safety, your happiness, those matter more to me than any material thing." Eleanor stared at him, tears still streaming down her face. "Why? Why do you care so much? We barely know each other." Thomas knew this was not the right time, that Eleanor was too shaken for declarations. But the words had been building in him for weeks, and he could not hold them back any longer. "Because I love you," he said simply. "I think I have loved you since the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach with bruises on your face and courage in your eyes. I love your strength and your intelligence. I love the way you throw yourself into teaching, the way you laugh at yourself when you make mistakes, the way you see beauty in everything around you. I love the person you are and the person you are becoming. And I know you are not ready to hear this, that you need more time, but I cannot let you believe for 1 second that you are a burden or that I regret helping you. Loving you has been the easiest, most natural thing I have ever done." Eleanor made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She pulled her hands free and cupped Thomas's face, her thumbs brushing over his cheekbones. "You foolish, wonderful man. Do you really think I have not noticed how I feel about you? Do you think I have not been fighting my own feelings because I was terrified of being hurt again?" Thomas's heart stuttered. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I love you too," Eleanor whispered. "I love your kindness and your integrity. I love the way you work yourself to exhaustion for this ranch, the way you speak about your father with such reverence, the way you treat everyone with respect regardless of their station. I love how safe I feel with you, how you make me laugh even when I am worried. I love you, Thomas Mercer, and I have been too frightened to admit it even to myself." Thomas surged up from his knees and kissed her, pouring months of longing and restraint into the contact. Eleanor kissed him back with equal fervor, her fingers threading through his hair, and for a long, perfect moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, to the miracle of finally being honest about what they felt. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, "not because you need protection or because you owe me anything. Marry me because we love each other and because I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright with joy despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. "Yes, yes, Thomas, I will marry you." From the kitchen, they heard Mrs. Chen's satisfied voice. "Finally, I was wondering how long you two would take to figure this out." Thomas and Eleanor broke apart, laughing, and Thomas realized that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt completely, perfectly happy. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony in Sweetwater, with most of the town attending. Sheriff Morrison gave Eleanor away, and Mrs. Chen served as Eleanor's witness, while Thomas's foreman stood up for him. Eleanor wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, with wildflowers from the ranch woven into her dark hair. Thomas wore his best suit, which was not saying much, but Eleanor told him he looked handsome enough to make her heart race. The ceremony was short and sweet, conducted by the new preacher, who stammered nervously through his first wedding. When Thomas kissed his bride, sealing their vows, the townspeople cheered and threw rice that Mrs. Chen had somehow procured for the occasion. Cyrus Blackwell was nowhere to be seen. True to Sheriff Morrison's prediction, he had retreated after the confrontation on the road, though Thomas heard rumors that he was still conducting business in the territory. But Blackwell stayed away from Sweetwater and the Mercer Ranch, and that was all Thomas cared about. The wedding celebration was held at the ranch, with tables set up outside despite the November chill. Mrs. Chen had cooked enough food to feed an army, and there was music and dancing that went on until the stars filled the sky. Thomas danced with his bride, holding her close and marveling at the fact that she was now his wife, that he got to wake up next to her every morning for the rest of his life. When the guests finally left and they were alone in the house, Mrs. Chen having tactfully decided to spend the night in town, Thomas carried Eleanor over the threshold of their bedroom. He set her down gently and took her face in his hands. "Are you happy?" he asked. Eleanor smiled, the expression radiant. "Happier than I ever thought possible. When I stepped off that stagecoach all those months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I had made a terrible mistake, and there was no way forward. But you showed me that endings can become beginnings. You gave me a second chance at life." "You gave me a second chance too," Thomas said. "A chance to love again, to build a future with someone, a chance to make this house a real home." They kissed, slow and sweet, and then Thomas drew back slightly. "I need you to know something," he said seriously. "What we do tonight, what happens in this marriage, it is your choice too. I will never force you or pressure you. If you need time—" Eleanor silenced him with a finger against his lips. "Thomas, I chose you. I chose this. I want to be your wife in every sense of the word." She took his hand and placed it over her heart. "Feel that? That is what you do to me. You make me feel alive and safe and desired all at once. I want this night with you. I want all our nights together." Thomas kissed her again, deeper this time, and Eleanor responded with a passion that took his breath away. They undressed each other with gentle hands and nervous laughter, learning the geography of each other's bodies with tenderness and wonder. When they finally came together, it felt like coming home, like two pieces of a puzzle slotting perfectly into place. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, Eleanor's head resting on Thomas's chest as he ran his fingers through her unbound hair. The intimacy of the moment was almost overwhelming, the simple fact that he got to hold her like this, that she was his and he was hers. "I love you," Eleanor murmured sleepily. "I love you too," Thomas replied, "more than I have words to say." "Then show me every day," Eleanor said, "through actions and choices and all the small moments that make a life. Show me you love me, and I will do the same for you." "Deal," Thomas said, and sealed it with a kiss to the top of her head. Eleanor continued teaching through the winter, though the school closed during the worst of the weather, when travel was too dangerous. On those days, she worked on lesson plans and read by the fire, while Thomas handled the ranch work that never truly stopped, even in deep winter. They settled into married life with surprising ease, learning each other's rhythms and habits, negotiating the small adjustments that came with sharing space and life. Mrs. Chen remained with them, now serving as housekeeper and friend rather than just employee. She taught Eleanor to cook some of the Chinese dishes she had grown up with, and Eleanor taught Mrs. Chen to read English better, helping her with the pronunciation that had always given her trouble. The three of them formed a small family unit that felt natural and right. In the spring, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told Thomas one morning over breakfast, her face glowing with happiness and nervousness, and Thomas felt his heart expand in his chest. A child. They were going to have a child. "Are you pleased?" Eleanor asked anxiously. "I know we have not been married long, and maybe we should have waited." Thomas pulled her into his arms, kissing her soundly. "I am overjoyed, terrified, but overjoyed. We are going to be parents, Eleanor." "You will be a wonderful father," Eleanor said, her hands resting on his chest. "I have seen how you are with the children at school, how patient and kind you are. Our child will be so lucky to have you." "And even luckier to have you," Thomas replied. He placed his hand over her still flat stomach, marveling at the life growing there. "We are going to raise this child, surrounded by love and beauty and opportunity. They will grow up knowing they are wanted and cherished. They will grow up knowing what it means to work hard and treat people with respect, Eleanor added. They will learn about books and ranching, about art and survival, about dreaming big and staying grounded. They will be the best of both of us, Thomas said, and kissed her again. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. Eleanor continued teaching until late June, when her condition made the daily travel too uncomfortable, and then she spent her time preparing the nursery and resting under Mrs. Chen's watchful eye. Thomas found himself torn between excitement and terror as the due date approached. He had helped birth countless calves and foals, but the idea of Eleanor going through childbirth frightened him in ways he could not articulate. In early September, a year after Eleanor had arrived in Sweetwater, their son was born. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Thomas paced outside the bedroom door, convinced something terrible was happening. But Mrs. Chen and the doctor she had summoned from town guided Eleanor through. And finally, blessedly, Thomas heard the thin wail of a newborn. He burst into the room to find Eleanor exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. Mrs. Chen smiled at him through tears of joy and gestured him forward. "Come meet your son," Eleanor said softly. Thomas approached the bed with shaking legs and looked down at the baby in Eleanor's arms. He was impossibly small, with a shock of dark hair and a red, angry face as he howled his displeasure at being born into the cold world. But to Thomas, he was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Can I hold him?" Thomas asked. Eleanor carefully transferred the baby to Thomas's arms, showing him how to support the tiny head. The moment Thomas held his son, something fundamental shifted inside him. He looked down at this perfect, fragile life that he and Eleanor had created together and felt love so overwhelming it brought tears to his eyes. "Hello, little one," Thomas whispered. "I am your father, and I promise you, I will do everything in my power to keep you safe and happy. I will teach you everything I know about this land and this life. I will show you how to be honorable and kind, and I will love you and your mother more than anything in this world." The baby stopped crying at the sound of Thomas's voice, his unfocused eyes trying to find the source. Thomas laughed, the sound wet with tears. "That is right. You recognize me. I have been talking to you for months through your mother's belly. I am glad you finally decided to join us." "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked, watching the two of them with soft eyes. Thomas thought about it. They had discussed names, had made lists, and debated options. But now that his son was here in his arms, only one name felt right. "James," Thomas said, "after my father, James Mercer, to carry on the legacy of this ranch and this family." Eleanor smiled. "James Mercer, it is perfect." The first year of James's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles. Thomas watched his son grow and change, marveling at each new development. James's first smile, directed at Eleanor while she sang him a lullaby. His first laugh, pulled from him when Thomas tickled his tiny feet. The way he would quiet when Mrs. Chen held him, soothed by her gentle Mandarin singing. Eleanor returned to teaching when James was 6 months old, bringing the baby with her to school. The students were delighted to have an infant in the classroom, and the older girls took turns helping Eleanor care for James between lessons. It was unconventional, but it worked, and Eleanor was happier teaching than she had been staying home, even though she loved motherhood. The ranch continued to thrive. Thomas's careful breeding program was paying off, and his cattle were among the best in the territory. He hired more men to help with the work, allowing him to spend more time with his family. Money was still sometimes tight, and there were challenges, droughts and harsh winters and market fluctuations. But Thomas faced them with Eleanor at his side, and that made all the difference. 2 years after James was born, Eleanor became pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to a daughter they named Clara, after Eleanor's mother. Clara came into the world with a lusty cry and her mother's violet eyes, and Thomas fell in love all over again. Life settled into a beautiful rhythm. Thomas and Eleanor raised their children with love and laughter, teaching them about books and ranching in equal measure. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved helping his father with the cattle. Clara was bright and mischievous, always getting into things she should not and charming her way out of trouble with her dimpled smile. Mrs. Chen remained with them as the children grew, becoming Auntie Chen to James and Clara, a beloved fixture in their lives. She taught them to count in Mandarin and to make dumplings, told them stories about China and the old days of the gold rush. Eleanor's school became a permanent institution in Sweetwater, widely regarded as one of the best in Montana Territory. She took pride in watching her students grow and succeed, seeing children she had taught go on to university or start successful businesses or become teachers themselves. The years rolled by, marked by the changing seasons and the gradual accumulation of memories. Thomas watched his children grow, watched silver begin to thread through Eleanor's dark hair, felt his own body grow tougher and more weathered from years of ranch work. But through it all, the love between him and Eleanor never dimmed. If anything, it grew deeper and stronger, rooted in shared experiences and unwavering support. They would sit on the porch on summer evenings, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains. Eleanor would lean against Thomas's shoulder, and he would wrap his arm around her, and they would marvel at the life they had built together. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked one evening when James was 10 and Clara was 8. "Coming to Montana, marrying me instead of living the life you planned back east?" Eleanor turned to look at him, her eyes still as beautiful as the day he first saw her step off that stagecoach. "Not for a single moment. This life, this family, it is more than I ever dreamed of having. You gave me a home, Thomas. Not just a physical place, but a sense of belonging. You gave me love and partnership and children who make my heart overflow. How could I ever regret that?" "I just want to make sure you are happy," Thomas said, "that you have not given up too much." "The only thing I gave up was fear and loneliness," Eleanor replied. She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Everything else has been gain. I have work I love, children who amaze me, and a husband who still makes my heart race after all these years. I am the luckiest woman in Montana Territory." "I am the lucky one," Thomas insisted. "You took a chance on a dusty rancher you barely knew. You could have chosen so many other paths. But this was the path that led to you," Eleanor said simply. "And that makes it the right path." On those evenings, watching the sun paint the sky in impossible colors while his wife sat beside him and his children played nearby, Thomas would remember that hot July day when a bruised, frightened woman stepped off a stagecoach and into his life. He would remember the fury and protectiveness that had surged through him, the instant certainty that he could not let her walk into danger. He had asked her, "Who did this?" And she had wept, and in that moment, both their lives had changed forever. Thomas had not known then that he was meeting his future wife, the mother of his children, the partner who would stand beside him through every joy and hardship. He had only known that she needed help, and he could provide it. Everything else, the love, the family, the life they built together, had grown from that simple act of compassion. As the years continued to pass, Thomas and Eleanor watched Montana Territory become the state of Montana. They saw Sweetwater grow from a rough frontier town into a proper community with paved streets and electric lights. They saw the railroad come through, bringing more settlers and more opportunities. Through it all, the Mercer Ranch remained a constant, a piece of the Old West preserved even as the world modernized around it. James grew into a fine young man who shared his father's love of the land, and he eventually took over much of the day-to-day running of the ranch. Clara followed her mother into teaching, opening her own school in a neighboring town. Thomas and Eleanor grew old together, their hands gnarled with age but still reaching for each other. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, filling their house with new generations who carried forward the legacy of courage and love that had begun with a mail-order bride who refused to accept a life of fear. On a warm summer evening in 1920, Thomas and Eleanor sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. Thomas was 76 now, Eleanor 72, and their bodies were not what they once were. But when Eleanor leaned against his shoulder and Thomas wrapped his arm around her, the gesture was as natural and necessary as breathing. "Do you remember the day we met?" Eleanor asked, her voice softer with age but still clear. "Every detail," Thomas replied. "You stepped off that stagecoach looking terrified and determined all at once. You had bruises on your face and courage in your eyes. I took one look at you and knew my life was about to change. I was so scared," Eleanor remembered. "Scared of Blackwell, scared of the unknown, scared of what would happen to me. And then you asked me who had hurt me, and when I wept, you did not turn away. You offered me safety and kindness when I desperately needed both." "Best decision I ever made," Thomas said. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life." "And loving you has been mine," Eleanor replied. She tilted her head up to look at him, her twilight eyes still beautiful even behind the wrinkles and age. "Thank you, Thomas Mercer. Thank you for seeing past the bruises to the person underneath. Thank you for giving me a chance to become who I was always meant to be." "Thank you for taking that chance," Thomas replied. "Thank you for choosing me, for building this life with me, for giving me a family and a purpose beyond just surviving. You made my house a home and my life a joy." They sat together as the sun set behind the mountains they both loved, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their pasts. Around them, the ranch hummed with life, the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance, grandchildren laughing somewhere inside the house, the wind whispering through the grass. It was not the life Eleanor had imagined for herself back in Philadelphia, and it was far more than Thomas had dared to dream when he was a lonely rancher with a struggling operation. But it was their life, built on love and trust and the simple courage to be kind when kindness mattered most. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Thomas Mercer held his wife close and thanked God or fate or simple chance for that hot July day in 1882, when a mail-order bride with bruises on her face stepped off a stagecoach and into his heart. Everything good in his life had flowed from that moment, from the decision to ask, "Who did this?" and to care about the answer. It had been the beginning of everything.